Welcome to the Module 6 video. In this module lesson, we're going to go over predominantly what syntax is and how that relates to sentences and grammar. So part of this involves knowing who your audience is. You should always think about who your audience is when you are writing and while you are writing, because you want to make sure that whatever you write is being understood by the people or person you are writing for. So there should never be any questions about what does this mean, or how do I interpret this, or am I supposed to know something in advance of this? Everything should be addressed through your writing. You have to make sure that whatever you write is clear for the person who is reading it. And so if you're writing for children, you're not going to use that academic high-level language. You're going to use words and phrases that they are familiar with. If you're writing for me as your instructor, the expectation is that you are writing in that academic language that was discussed back in Module 2 and continues to be discussed throughout this course. You're not having a conversation, you are presenting information and ideas in an academic manner. One of the first things to consider with this is the use of active and passive voice. Now, if you are an English language learner, this might be new to you because not all languages have active and passive voices. But in English, we do have this. Active voice is when we have the subject ahead of any other objects in a sentence. Active voice often results in shorter sentences, but those sentences are oh so much clearer and easier to translate. Passive voices put the object ahead of the subject in the sentence and are often longer sentences and more difficult to translate. So if you're not sure, by the way, your word processor, Microsoft Word, that you get with the college, can identify this through the grammar checker in its tools. It will identify which sentences are in active or passive voice, and if you need to fix any of that voice. Now, as you are writing too, your writing should be organized. Organization means that the writing progresses in a logical order, where there is a clear beginning, middle, and end. And when you see this, you should be able to, in your 5-paragraph essay that you're doing in Module 8, you shouldn't be able to rearrange any of those paragraphs. They should be building on one another, and that gives it that order. The thesis statement, too, that you will be required to write helps to create that expectation and create the pattern in the writing. Good writing is also cohesive. That means that your own writing voice is consistent within the paper. If I am reading your paper and suddenly it sounds like somebody else is talking in my head, because that's how we read papers, we talk in our head. If it sounds like there is one person talking and now there's another person talking, that's jarring, that's inconsistent. To help make your paper cohesive too, you want to use transitional words. Transitional words and phrases are used to help you guide the reader. And they are used so that you can follow, as a reader, the thought process of the writer. So if I want my reader to be able to connect ideas or connect evidence to a statement I'm making, I'll use those transitional words to help guide them. In order to keep our voice consistent, one of the other things we do is we use paraphrasing. Again, we avoid quotations in most academic writing because it changes that voice. We want to keep the voice consistent. We introduce our evidence. When we bring it in, we don't just drop it in and then leave it alone. We need to introduce it. We need to link it to our own ideas and information. A common issue I see sometimes in writing is because students want to include evidence, they will drop in some sort of piece of information that comes from a source, but they don't connect it to the other ideas they have in their writing. So it just sort of looks out of place. You're also working to get rid of any unnecessary information or words. If it does not add things to your paper that help you to understand it or help the reader to follow it, it's not useful. You also need to watch out for tense. Again, tense exists in English, but it doesn't exist in all languages. So if you are speaking another language as your native language that doesn't have tense, this is often a sticking point too. As much as possible in our academic writing and through APA, we try to write in present tense and ideally present perfect tense, which is down here. Now, what makes it perfect as opposed to continuous? This is just the terminology that English majors use to help differentiate between the different ways that we can write in tense. So as much as possible, write in present tense. If it's something that is historical or something that has happened in the past, you can use past tense. Just be mindful that, again, for that translation purpose and for understanding, it is best to write in present tense. Future tense, we only ever really use when we're talking about what people should do with the information we are sharing with them. So when you get to the essay assignment, one of the things you'll be asked to do in your conclusion is to create a call to action for the reader. And so that could be done in future tense, but everything else, as much as possible, present tense. And that unification. All the body paragraphs and all your content in your paper should go around the thesis statement. We should all be able to link it back to that thesis statement. And then within your body paragraphs, you should start it with a topic sentence that lets the reader know what this paragraph is going to focus on, and that is also going to be tied back to your thesis statement. Now, within your writing too, you want to make sure you have a consistent voice. Now, I've already talked about voice in terms of making sure you don't jump between different voices. It sounds like different people are in your head. You also want to be as confident and use that active writing voice as much as possible. The more you write, the more you develop your own writing voice. And this ties into your writing style and the tone of your writing too. But I know that as you write more, people can pick something up that you've read and say, oh, this was written by this person. I can tell because that information in there, the words they use, the way they write, it sounds like them. Style connects with this as well. We should see consistent formatting based on APA guidelines, but also in how you use language and how you build out your arguments. Again, recall from Module 2, you need to avoid any writing that does not mean what it literally says. So things like cliches, colloquialisms, euphemisms, idioms, slang, jargon, personification, and anthropomorphism, where we treat things that aren't human as if they were human. We have to be careful about how we do that. And just like voice, writers develop their own style over time. There are certain things that I do in my writing that are distinct to me. The way I write sentences, the way I organize information, that's based on my own writing style. And then tone. So different writing assignments might require a different tone, but for your essay in this course, you're expected to have a formal, professional, and factual tone. And this is done through using academic writing guidelines, through presenting evidence and source information accurately, and through connecting your ideas in a way that allows the reader to follow them. Now, a big thing in APA is clear and concise writing. If you tend to overwrite, you might be helped by being able to look for words that aren't really adding anything to your arguments or to the points you are trying to make. Sometimes you can use AI tools to help you identify any information or words or phrases that aren't necessary for making your point. Again, AI should not write for you, but it can help you review your writing. You also want to make sure that the words you use are specific. A very common issue I see in writing, and one that often indicates that a person has used AI to write, is when your wording is not precise and specific. If you use vague words like stuff, things, or words that don't really have any explained meaning, then it's not helpful. So oftentimes a good essay will include examples of what is meant by specific words or specific ideas. If you just throw those things in there without explaining them, it tells me you probably don't know how to use those words appropriately. There are some general hints you can use, but this is only a little bit. A lot of being able to check wordiness requires you to review and analyze what you're doing in your writing. So a couple hints here though. If you are starting sentences with there is or there are, often that indicates that you are writing in passive voice. And so you want to rearrange your sentence so that you are writing in active voice. So the wordy sentence here, there are two major experiments that the biology department sponsors. Here our object is ahead of our subject, so we switch it around. The biology department sponsors two major experiments. The other problem with the wordy one is you'll notice biology is capitalized here. If we go back to our capitalization rules, we only capitalize courses that are specifically named. So if it was Biology 101, we'd keep the capital. But because we're just talking generally in terms of a department, we don't need to capitalize biology. We also have sentences that have way too many modifiers. And modifiers are any sort of adjectives or adverbs or descriptive pieces that really don't help the meaning at all and make it more complex and more wordy so people have a harder time following your thought process. So in the wordy example, we have two extremely famous and well-known consumer advocates spoke eloquently in favor of the proposed important legislation. Well, to begin, if somebody is extremely famous, chances are they are also well known. This is redundant. These two things mean the same. So if I get rid of one, it helps to clarify it. And then because I get rid of one, I don't need and anymore. The other parts here that we don't need to really include, the word eloquently. Okay, what is this adding? Well, it's nice that they spoke very clearly and competently because that's what speaking eloquently is about. However, in terms of what this adds to the information, probably doesn't add much. It's great if you're doing a creative writing piece to describe how somebody is speaking, but in terms of what it does for an academic paper, not a lot. The other thing we notice here is important we get rid of. And that's because by its nature, legislation involves laws and policies and guidelines. So it's automatically important. If it's important enough to be legislation, it's important, period. So we can get rid of a lot of excess words that don't really help anything we're writing about. Now, when we talk about sentences and syntax, If you came out of high school in Alberta and maybe a teacher wrote on a paper once syntax, lots of people don't actually know what syntax means, or at least it hasn't been explained to them. It's just sort of one of those words people are expected to somehow know through osmosis. Syntax is talking about the organization of your words and phrases. It can refer to paragraphs, but more often when teachers talk about syntax, they're talking about your sentences. Do your sentences make sense? Do they have a meaning? Do they work in a way that I understand what you are talking about? Syntax is not the same as diction. It's not the same as semantics. And a really big challenge for those of you who are English language learners is that the syntax differs in its own language. So what might be true for the syntax rules that you have in Arabic will be different in English, for example. And this can definitely make it more difficult to learn English, especially for the writing piece. We also see that syntax changes over history. So if you go back to Shakespearean eras, early Renaissance periods, people tend to talk in English with subject, object, verb, or object, subject, verb. And so if you look at the examples on the screen here, these are what were commonly used during the Shakespearean era, but are no longer as used today for the purpose of clarity and being able to translate. Now, any sentence should be complete, which is to say that it has a subject and a verb and represents a complete idea. Your subject is usually a noun, some sort of person, place, thing, or idea. Sometimes you can use a pronoun in place of that noun. You can also have compound subjects where you have two people, for example, are the subject of a sentence, or you might even have a list of things which become the subject of a sentence. Your verbs are those actions, states, or occurrences, and verbs are where we see tense the most often. And then there's a lot of subcategories of verbs. So you can have verbs that are there to help or to link things. When people think about verbs, they're mostly thinking about the action verbs that answer the question, what is the subject doing? But we also have linking verbs that help connect our subject to descriptions like was or seemed. We also have those helping verbs that are used for grammatical correctness. So for example, grammatically incorrect would be to say, I seen him. And so we add in the word have to make it grammatically correct. I have seen him. That makes it grammatical. And I know in casual language, we don't always use these, but it is required in academic writing. Now, sentences are sometimes called independent clauses because this is a phrase or a group of words that can be a sentence by itself. It doesn't need anybody else. It's an independent sentence. It's by itself. And so to be a complete sentence, you have to be an independent clause. However, we also have phrases that don't form complete thoughts or are incomplete. And we call these dependent clauses because in order for them to make sense, they have to be attached to that independent clause. So a sentence could have more than one clause in it. It could have the independent clause. It always has to have an independent clause, but it could have an independent clause connected to a dependent clause. It could also have an independent clause attached to another independent clause. But it needs to have at least one thing that could be a sentence by itself. And sentences that are missing some component for them to be a complete idea are called fragments. So some general syntax rules for English. All sentences are going to require a subject and verb. And this is specifically for academic writing. So the shortest sentence in the English language is go, as it's shown here, because it is directing an action based on dialogue. But in academic writing, this wouldn't work as a complete sentence because it's based on dialogue and conversation. So you need to have a subject and a verb in all your sentences. A single sentence should focus on one main idea. If you have multiple ideas within the same sentence, it becomes more difficult for the reader to follow. It is not a 100% rule in that we don't always have to just have one main idea. For example, you might have a sentence that is being used to connect the ideas presented in the previous sentence to the ideas that you're about to explain. So a connection of ideas. But if your sentences are getting overly complex, they are difficult to follow and it's better to break it up. In English, to use that active voice, we're going to use subject, verb, object as much as possible. Occasionally, the odd passive voice is fine, but predominantly you should be using active voice. We put our adjectives, so adjectives are anything that describes a noun, and our adverbs, so adverbs are anything that describe a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. Those go before the words they describe in English. And we also have what are called subordinate clauses. This is a type of dependent clause that is connected to an independent clause. And so it's just showing, there's these parts of speech or these phrases within speech that require us to provide that additional information to form complete sentences. One thing that is not in here that probably should be is that you should not start a sentence with what are called coordinating conjunctions. So you should not start a sentence with words like and, but, or, yet, so. These words are traditionally going to begin phrases that might be dependent or that might be used for connection to another independent clause, but they should not be sentence starters because they are intended for connection. We also have another type of word and phrase called prepositional phrases. Prepositional phrases are often going to be dependent clauses, meaning that when you see a prepositional word, and we've got a list of some of them here, they are going to rely on a full sentence. So in this example, Maya and Tia found an abandoned cat. That part here that's underlined could be a sentence by itself. This is your independent clause. But then we have this additional information, by the side of the road. Now, if I just had by the side of the road itself, it would not be a complete sentence. If I put the word by the side of the road on a piece of paper with nothing else there, you would be asking questions because by the side of the road, what? And so this is an example of a prepositional phrase, specifically a dependent clause that relies on the independent clause to have meaning. So the word by here tells you where the abandoned cat was, but it doesn't work on a sentence by itself. It needs to be attached to a full sentence. We can also break it up within a sentence. So if I had the book is my favorite, that is a complete sentence. That would be your independent clause here, but we're adding some additional information in the center of that with the tattered cover. Again, if I just had with the tattered cover as a sentence by itself, we would call this a fragment because it has incomplete information. This is, again, being used to describe place or existence in this case. So this describes the book, some additional information. It's dependent, though, on that independent clause. We can also start with the preposition. And when we do that, we have a comma after it. In the park, comma, children were playing. So children were playing could be a sentence by itself, but in the park could not be, because we're asking information. In the park, what? So we need that additional information. Now, fragments, again, these are incomplete sentences, essentially. They're missing something. And so in your writing, you should not have fragments. You should not have things that cannot stand by themselves as a sentence, because while we might use them in conversation, they are not appropriate for academic writing. So, saw the movie last night? We might say that to a friend to let them know what we did last night, but in academic writing, we need to include the subject. Cars that cost too much. If somebody asked you a question about what bugs you and you say cars that cost too much, that would make sense. But again, academic writing, we're not having a conversation. So you need to indicate and create that complete sentence that has that subject, it has that verb, and it forms a complete thought. The person that helped me. Again, not a complete thought. The person that helped me works at the bank. Great, that fixes it. And how you fix it depends on what you're talking about. So you are the only one that can fill in that missing information to make sure that the reader understands. We can also fix dependent clauses by adding more information. Because Rosa was tired, again, in conversation, we might use this to answer a question about Rosa, but in academic writing, we need to make sure the thought is complete. Because Rosa was tired, she decided to go home. Okay, and if we are starting with something that is a preposition, we're going to have that comma after the prepositional phrase. After Rohit crashed the car into the tree. Again, might be the answer to a question when we're talking to somebody, but in writing we need a complete thought. The police came after Rohit crashed the car into the tree. If we graduate next year, not a complete thought. I have questions if this was just on a piece of paper. If we graduate next year, we will start looking for employment. Great, complete thought. That's what we want. Do watch out for any sentence that begins with what's called a gerund. Again, these are sort of terms that you don't need to memorize, but help to shape the rules, the syntax of how we use things. A gerund is a verb that ends in ing, that is acting like a noun. We try to watch out for these, the same with watching out for sentences that begin with prepositions, because often it might indicate that we have an incomplete thought. So here I have a preposition because to is a preposition. To get to work on time, not a complete thought. To get to work on time, I had to take an earlier bus. Now we have a complete thought, and because we're starting with the prepositional phrase, we put a comma before we have our independent clause, the thing that could be a sentence by itself. Seeing the children fight. Okay, this is an example of a gerund. Seeing the children fight, I ran to intervene. Okay, now it's a complete thought, but just like the prepositional phrases, if we have a gerund starting a sentence, we need to put a comma before the part that could be a sentence by itself. Run-on sentences. Run-on sentences are when we are trying to combine two things that can be sentences by themselves, but we don't do it with punctuation or any sort of conjunctions. So conjunctions, again, are those connecting words. And there's three basic ways that we can fix a run-on sentence. So for example, we have this sentence, none of my friends liked the movie, I did not see it. This is an example of a run-on sentence because it has, in this case, two independent clauses, so two things that could be sentences by themselves. None of my friends liked the movie could be a sentence by itself. I did not see it could be a sentence by itself. They both form complete thoughts. If we want to connect these two sentences, we have a couple choices. We can put a comma after the first thing that could be a sentence and use what's called a coordinating conjunction. So those are those connecting words that we use. And there are, and this shows up on another slide, but I want to just make sure, the fanboys words. So here's an acronym that I use to remember them. For and, this is supposed to be an N, it looks kind of W-y. Nor, but, or, yet, so. So these are the coordinating conjunctions. So we pick one of these that works after the comma, and now we have a grammatically correct sentence. None of my friends liked the movie, but I did not see it. Now this functions as a whole sentence that's combining two independent clauses. Another thing we can do, going back to our understanding of punctuation in Module 3, is we can put a semicolon between these two things that could be sentences. They do have to be related sentences, though. None of my friends liked the movie. I did not see it. So all we've done here is we've put a semicolon between those two things. Again, they need to be related. I couldn't say none of my friends liked the movie. I am having salmon for dinner. Those two things aren't connected in terms of the thoughts. So we need to make sure that any sentences that we want to connect that way are connected in relationship to one another. Or if it works better for you and your writing style, you could just break it into two separate sentences. None of my friends liked the movie. I did not see it. Okay. Now those coordinating conjunctions, those are those words I just showed you on the last slide there. And we use these to connect. We use them for a lot of things beyond connecting independent clauses. But when you are using them to connect independent clauses, remember that you have to put a comma after the first thing that would be a sentence. And then just because these are all coordinating conjunctions does not mean that they will all work for the information you are sharing. So you have to pick one of them that works the best for what you are sharing. So the run-on sentence here, Grandma still rides her Harley motorcycle. So that's something that could be a sentence by itself. So an independent clause. Her toy poodle balance, I think that should be balances, in a basket between the handlebars. So this could also be an independent clause, a sentence by itself. And so if you wanted to connect that using a coordinating conjunction, remember that you need to put a comma after the thing that could be a sentence by itself, and then pick whichever of these fanboy words works best for how you are working in that information. So when I went through this one, I noticed that and, but, and so could be able to work depending on what else I'm talking about in my writing. But some of the others would not make sense. You just can't randomly pick one of these. You have to pick one that makes sense. Another common issue in writing is what's called comma splicing. Comma splicing is any sort of issue where a comma is misused, specifically when we are just putting a comma between two independent clauses, but we're not putting in one of those fanboy words. So if I said, I went to Disney World last summer, it was so much fun. Okay, so these are two things that, again, could be sentences on their own. two independent clauses, and I put a comma between them, but a comma is not enough. So either I need to change it to a semicolon, or I need to put in one of those fanboy words to make sure that the sentence is grammatically correct. Another thing we need to watch out for in our writing, especially when we're listing things or comparing things, is making sure our writing demonstrates parallelism. So parallelism, in math, when we talk about things being parallel, we're talking about, lines that never cross. They go on side by side forever. And it's a very similar idea in English writing. In English writing, we are trying to, again, when we're listing or comparing things, we want to make sure that whatever those things are in the same format. As readers, we often correct parallelism in our heads, but if we read it out loud, it would become incredibly awkward to say or a little bit weird. So let's go through some examples here. Kelly had to iron, do the washing, and shopping before her parents arrive. So here we've got a list of the thing Kelly needs to do. Okay, so the root of this sentence would be Kelly had to. And different teachers might call these different things. I'm going to call it the root of the sentence. I've also seen people call it the stem, other things that often relate to trees for some reason, not sure why. And so we have our list: iron, do the washing, and shopping. Before her parents arrived is just some additional information. You'll notice that this is a prepositional phrase indicating time. So this is a dependent clause that depends on the rest of the information. But you'll notice that doesn't change when it's corrected. So this part here, we're not as worried about. What we are concerned about is making sure that this root of the sentence can connect to everything that is in the list. So I do this by saying it out loud. Kelly had to iron. Okay, that makes sense. Kelly had to do the washing. Okay. Kelly had to shopping. That one doesn't make as much sense when you say it out loud. So to make this more grammatically correct, and there's different ways that you can do this, the way that I've chosen to done it is I changed my root to Kelly had to do the. So it's a little bit of a longer root now, but I've also changed all of this things that Kelly has to do to have the same format: ironing, washing, shopping. They all end in that same way. They're all one word. So structurally, they're all the same. And now if I take my root, I should be able to connect it to any part of that sentence there. Kelly had to do the ironing. Makes sense. Kelly had to do the washing. Still makes sense. Kelly had to do the shopping. Still makes sense. So now it's parallel in structure. For this next one, I have driving a car requires. So this part here, this is going to be my root. It requires coordination. So that makes sense. It requires patience. That makes sense. Driving a car requires to have good eyesight. That one's awkward in terms of how it sounds when we speak it out loud. So we're going to change just the last one so it's more in line with the structure of the rest. Driving a car requires coordination. Driving a car requires patience. Driving a car requires good eyesight. Now each of those things that connects to that root make grammatical sense and structure is consistent. And then this last one here, we have a comparison. Comparisons we usually see with words like to or than, between the parts that need to be compared. So in these cases here, we want to make sure that what is being compared is in the same structure. So Ali prefers is the root here, and you'll notice that doesn't change. What we are comparing are jeans and wearing a suit. So right now, we might be able to make sense of that in our heads, but we still want the structure to be parallel. So you could say Ali prefers jeans to suits, or what I've done here is I've said Ali prefers wearing jeans to wearing a suit. Now we have more consistent structure between those comparisons. Now there's some different ways that we can help to create parallelism within our writing when we're listing things or making comparisons. So in this first one here, we're going to show the example of using fanboys to structure it. When I walk the dog, I like to, so this is the root of the original. I like to listen to music. I like to talking to friends on the phone. So the second part there doesn't sound as consistent. So we want to make that structure more consistent between each other. When I walk the dog, I like listening to music and talking to friends on the phone. So here, what we have listed, and it's only a list of two, but those two things are now put into the same structure. When we're looking at comparisons, again, often using the word than, sometimes using the word to, like on the last slide, we want to make sure the things before and after the comparison are structured the same. Swimming in the ocean is more difficult than a pool. Yeah, we can make sense of that in our heads, but in academic writing, especially when we want to consider that in academic writing things should be easy to translate, we want to make sure the structure is parallel. Swimming in the ocean is more difficult than swimming in a pool. We've got the structure now the same between both sides of that comparison. Additionally, another form of conjunction is called a correlative conjunction, which are pairs of words that show relationships within a sentence. And these words, like either or, they'll show up in the sentence in different places. And it's not always one comes before the other. They show up together in sentences somehow. So we can neither wait for something to happen, nor can we start taking evasive action. So this is the neither nor pair. Here, this parallel structure here is, generally it's okay. We'd be able to figure out the one ahead in our brains as we're reading it. But this part here, or better yet, with the can here, it breaks up that parallel structure between that comparison that's happening. And the comparison here is happening with the nor. Neither wait for something to happen nor take evasive action. Now, if you're a reader or if you like to listen to speeches or talks, good orators, good people who speak for a living, are very good at using parallelism. And this is also true of people who write as well. There's lots of examples of writing that use good parallel structures. And it's done to emphasize a point or to make things memorable. Commercials are often really good at using parallelism because they're trying to make a point about how great their product is and also make it memorable. Well, we have some examples of this in English writing and English speeches. The inherent vice of capitalism, the inherent virtue of socialism. So we're copying that sort of same structure there. John F. Kennedy, when he was speaking in the 60s there, he's like, let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any foe, oppose any Oh, sorry, should be support any friend. And this parallelism helps to make this more memorable, helps it to make it more emphasized, and overall improves the quality of that speech. Very famous in the United States, Abraham Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address said, "Of the people, by the people, for the people," to emphasize that it's about the people as a whole. And my personal favorite is in Dr. Martin Luther King's Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. He repeats each sentence. He starts all sentences with "I have a dream." And this really sticks to that collective consciousness. It still comes up today, whether or not you even heard the speech that he's given. Chances are you have heard about it because it has been so impactful. Now, one of the issues sometimes we see in sentences are with what are called participles. Participles are verbs that have been used to create adjectives, to change tense, or in passive language sentences. There are generally 3 types of participles. And again, this deals with tense again. So past participles, we often make these by taking the verb and adding ed, dt, n, or n to the verb. It really depends on the specific word itself, which is part of the challenge with writing in English, because which one we use depends on the word. And it's used to indicate past tense, so things that have happened previously. We were exhausted after cleaning, so it's happened in the past. Here we have it as a participle phrase, disgusted by the terrible stench. So this indicates past tense again. It also helps to describe what's going on. Present participle, this is where we often add ing to the verb. It's not quite the same as a gerund. Gerunds often begin sentences. So this is where we can use it to make an adjective, so something that's describing something else. She bought a new pair of running shoes. So here, running is not acting like a verb. It's being used to describe the type of shoes she got. Running shoes. We can use it as a participle phrase, kind of like a gerund, thinking quickly. So this quickly is describing how the person was thinking. She threw the pillow under the vase before it hit the ground. So thinking here is not just a verb, it's also a description of what she has done. And then we use it for tense. We are eating lunch, so this would be in present tense. We can also have what's called a perfect participle. This is, you might think past, present, this might be future. It's not, it's something else. It's where we often use other helping words or verbs to make sense of something. Having finished his homework, the child ran outside to play with friends. So here, having is used to help the verb finished. So it's like a helping verb almost. Now, participles can also have challenges if they are misplaced or what are called dangling. And so this is where we have descriptions or extra information, or even sometimes the verb itself, where it's not clearly connected to what it is trying to modify or describe or explain. And so when we see these, our brain generally is okay at figuring out what is supposed to be communicated, but to make sure that we are communicating things accurately the way we want readers to understand it, we want to make sure things are connected properly. So here we have the sentence, turning on the kitchen light, the woman surprised the thief in her nightgown. Now there's 2 ways we can interpret this sentence. One is that the woman is wearing the nightgown. The second way we can interpret it is that the thief is wearing the nightgown, and we might interpret it that way because the thief is closer to this information than the woman is. And so to fix that, to make sure the reader understands, we want to make sure the in the nightgown part is closer attached to the woman. Turning on the kitchen light, the woman in her nightgown surprised the thief. So we put it ahead of the verb. Here we have, they bought a kitten for my brother called Shadow. Two ways to interpret this sentence: that the kitten is called Shadow, or that the brother is called Shadow. Brother is closer to that name, and it could be that there is a brother named Shadow. But if the intention of this sentence is to say that the kitten is called Shadow, we want to make sure that that description, that information, is more closely connected to the kitten than the brother. So they bought a kitten called Shadow for my brother. Now it's clearly connected. Blown away by the storm, the family could not find the roof of their house. There's two ways we can interpret this one. We can think that, so blown away by the storm, we might think that that is the family that was blown away by the storm. Or we might think it's the roof of the house. Here we have the family closer connected to the blown away by the storm part. So people might more likely interpret it as the family was blown away. So to make sure that our readers understand that we meant the roof was what was blown away, we want to make sure that information is much closer to that information about the storm. So the family could not find the roof of their house after it was blown away by the storm. Now we have a better connection. We know better what was blown away by the storm. So danglers, which is kind of a funny name, but I don't come up with them. Short for dangling modifiers or any sort of words or phrases that describe something not included within the sentence. It is very close to a dependent clause, in as much as we don't have enough information here for it to be by itself. Danglers, they're quite common in creative writing. So if you're reading a story, you'll see them. But in academic writing, again, we need to make sure we have complete information in the sentence so that sentence can be by itself. So in this first one, we have riding in the sports car, the world whizzed by. Again, this might be great for creative writing, but is not giving us a clear understanding for academic writing. So we might need to indicate who is riding. Jane. So now we can say, as Jane was riding in the sports car, the world whizzed by. Great. Now it's a complete sentence. All done. Painting for 3 hours at night, the kitchen was finally finished. Again, common in creative writing, or even in your conversational language. But in academic writing, we need to make sure we have that subject, we have that verb, and we have a complete thought. So here we're missing the subject. We need to know who was painting. So we're going to add in Maggie here. We're going to adjust the sentence a bit to make sure we have that complete thought. Next one, walking home at night, the trees looked like spooky aliens. And one thing to indicate here is I've corrected those last two in one way. There are different ways you can correct it. The key idea, though, is that you need to make sure you have that subject, you have that verb, and you are making a complete thought with your writing in a sentence. So here we're missing the subject of the sentence, so we add that in. As Jonas was walking home at night, the trees looked like spooky aliens. We could also flip that sentence. The trees looked like spooky aliens as Jonas was walking home at night. But now it's a complete thought. Some other things to watch for when you are working on writing good sentences. You can use AI tools to check for syntax issues. Make sure that you correct them once it's been identified to you. Again, remember, AI you cannot use to write for you. You can use it to proofread for editing purposes. So, editing being the mechanics, the syntax, the grammar, those sorts of things to help make your writing more readable. You also want to make sure that your sentences have varied lengths. When sentences are all the same length, they tend to read as if a robot wrote them. And so it doesn't help the reader keep interested and engaged in what they are reading. Also, watch out for your words that you start sentences with. I have noticed that at times some students will start several sentences in a row with the same word, which sounds really awkward when we are reading it. Make sure you are varying your sentence beginnings. You're not overusing those same sentence beginnings, especially in close proximity. Doesn't mean that every sentence in an essay needs to start with a different word, but you should have some variation. And remember too, again, you are not trying to converse with the reader in academic writing. You're not having a conversation, so there shouldn't be questions, there shouldn't be exclamations, and similarly, you shouldn't have question marks or exclamation points. That's not part of academic writing. It might happen in storybooks, but not in academic writing. So for this module, make sure you've completed the notes for this class. There are a few things to read. One, chapter 3 from Horkoff, and then chapters 2, 3, and 5 of Kaiserman. And there's also 4 H5P activities that you need to complete to help you practice with syntax as well as some of that active voice. At the end of this module, there is quiz 5, which will be focused on syntax. So make sure you do those things because you can use your class notes for that quiz. And that will help you achieve a greater mark and help you in your overall writing for modules 7 and 8.